Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak. What I thought would be quite interesting is to show you the work that we've been doing with your data. So my background is in neurogenetics and biochemistry. I've worked in sunny Leeds, sunnier Sydney, and then I was recruited from Sydney back to Newcastle about 10 years ago. And one of the things I've really learned is that the UK is really punches above its weight when it comes down to medical research. And most people, when you think about it on a global scale, you wouldn't think that. But the reason we do it is not just because of the scientists. In fact, we play the smallest part. One of the reasons why we punch above our weight is because we have such a high level of engagement from people, and people like yourselves. Whether it be studying dementia, whether it be studying heart disease, whether it be studying type 2 diabetes. And I'm very proud to say that the North East is right at the front of that. That creates us a little bit of a problem though, because we have such an engagement from people from the North East, and we have such a high output of research from the North East, we're not entirely sure whether the Geordie physiology transcends across the rest of the world. And I'm going to speak about diabetes today, which is what I do in my day job. So the reason why I'm interested in diabetes, and today I'll talk a little bit about type 2 diabetes, is because it's a fascinating condition. We all know somebody who has diabetes, and we know even more people who don't have diabetes. But it has a real impact on us as individuals, but also it has a real impact on society as well. And it has an impact because it is so prevalent. So 1 in 11 people develop type 2 diabetes, which is why we all know someone who has it. Now, type 2 diabetes is also very interesting because 1 in 3 people at risk of diabetes don't know it yet. So this is a real time bomb for the UK, because one of the things that we're great at now is living longer and longer and longer. So forget the headlines, this is a great time to be alive. But the problem is, as we live longer, more people are developing type 2 diabetes. And then because we're developing diabetes, we're having more heart problems. We're having more problems with things like dementia, more problems with things like stroke. And so although we're living longer, great news, woohoo! The reality is, actually the quality of life in later years is diminished. So the challenge for us as researchers is to give you the perfect life. The perfect life is, of course, not happy, 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 a bit unhappy, a bit grumpy, very unhappy, slightly socially isolated, have multiple conditions. I'm really struggling at the end of life and what my value is in society. What we really want is the perfect life, which is happy, 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 dead. So we're trying to understand that, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. The key for us is, how do you keep people engaged? How do you keep people alive, living a happier life? Keep quality of life as high as you can. Now, another reason type 2 diabetes is because you're twice as likely to have a heart attack. And because of that, quality of life changes. The chance of cancer drops down. But that's because people with type 2 diabetes don't live long enough to have cancer as a whole. So cancer rates go down. But the really big number here is that type 2 diabetes is the single biggest healthcare cost to the NHS. We spend 10% of our total budget. So last year, us taxpayers, spent over £10 billion helping people with a disease which is essentially preventable, and if you do have type 2 diabetes, it's reversible. So the challenge for us in looking at Biobank is to understand exactly that. How can we help people make better decisions, whether they be care teams, whether they be community planners, whether they be policy makers, or whether they be you and me? How can we make people make better, more informed decisions about how to prevent and reverse diabetes? And this is a summary of 15 years worth of work. It's a bit depressing, isn't it? So, for many long-term conditions, of which type 2 diabetes is a good example, this is what it comes down to. The calories in, the calories out, and genetics. Now in type 2 diabetes, we've learned that these two big things, calories in and calories out, dominate any genetics. In fact, your genes only predict about 18% of your risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So 82% comes down to calories in and calories out. And the more we learn about the genetics, and Biobank is right at the fore of this, it's showing us that these genes are called susceptibility genes. It means you won't develop it unless you have a specific behavior. And so our real interest is to understand how genes and lifestyle interact so that we can help give you the right information on how to be making decisions. So we can be giving councils the right information about where they should be putting bus stops, where they should be putting car exclusion zones, to try and help people change behaviour at a big scale. And hopefully I'm going to come back to that. So this is some data. This isn't from Biobank, but it's a good introduction. It just looks like a big squiggle, doesn't it? It's amazing when you look at something. But what there are is there's bunches of yellow dots and green dots. Now the yellow dots are obese people and the green dots are non-obese people. And the lines between them are how they know each other. Now, for those of you at the back, you can't quite pick it out. But one thing you'll notice is that yellow dots are friends with yellow dots. The people at the front, please confirm if that's right. And green dots are friends with green dots. Or put another way, big people are friends with big people. And skinny people are friends with skinny people. And over time, if you track this, and you saw someone who moved from yellow dot friends to green dot friends, they lose weight. And if you move from green dot friends to yellow dot friends, you gain weight. So inadvertently, we found out the cure for weight management. If you're overweight, change your friends. Now, because I like my friends, well, some of them, I was really interested in why that happens to some people and why it doesn't to others. So we all know people who are big and are in perfect health. And they say they sit there eating pies and they've got no problem. They don't have diabetes. And I was really interested in understanding how can we give people more specific advice rather than lose weight and move more. Because if I have to change my friends, I'm going to be pretty grumpy. So this is where Biobank is really fascinating, because what it can do is it can allow us to look at 3 layers. So the first layer is what you do. The next layer is how diseases interact. And the third layer is the genetics and some of the biochemistry of what's actually going on underneath the bonnet. And it's really fascinating because it's in one place you can look at all 3 of these. So instead of geneticists just saying, oh, type 2 diabetes, it's because of your genes. And lifestyle people going, no, it's because you eat too much and you move too little. We can really start to probe these and look at them together. And that's important because it means we can make better decisions as individuals and collectively. And so the first piece of work that we did was looking at what I've called the behavioural phenotype. Now that's geek for how do people move, eat and sleep. So the nice part about type 2 diabetes, about UK Biobank, is that you have an enormous number of people who don't have disease. And the interesting part about that is we can use them to understand why don't they have disease. And so we then separated out people with cardiovascular disease, people with diabetes, and we excluded people who had other conditions. Okay, sounds a bit cutthroat, doesn't it, as you go through? But that's one of the fantastic things about having 500,000 people, is you can just take them very, very cleanly so you can look at different groups. And then in the type 2 diabetes group, I was able to take the ones who have been diagnosed with diabetes and those who had diabetes with heart problems, so more advanced diabetes. And I was really interested in understanding whether these people acted differently. Forget about genetics, what goes on with things they do in their everyday life. So you remember answering how much TV you watched? Yeah? So this is the first piece of data. So what we did is we took the people without disease and we split them into quarters. So red is bad, green is good, as in red you sit a lot, green you sit a little. And then we're able to have a look at that over the different groups. And the first thing you'll pay attention to is that the red, as soon as you end up with heart disease, there's more people who sit a lot. And then if you have type 2 diabetes, you sit even more. If you have type 2 diabetes and heart disease, you sit even more again. So even without any fancy genetics, people who have different diseases act differently. But we also know exactly the same happens for physical activity. So the questionnaire that you filled and what you did every day. So the people who don't have disease were more active as a group than the other groups as they go down. But also sleep. Now, sleep is something that I'm obsessed with, and that's because I have a 3-year-old child and a 5-year-old child. But also, when I was in Australia, I did a lot of work looking at sleep and metabolism. So if I took one of my 21-year-old medical students and took them from 8 hours sleep to 4 hours sleep, within 4 days, they would have the same level of insulin resistance as somebody with type 2 diabetes. Just by sleep restricting them. And you give them an all-you-can-eat buffet, and they'll eat 800 calories more, 2 full muffins more, than somebody who's had a good night's sleep. And it makes sense, because if your body's tired, it's stressed, so you want to eat more, you need the calories. But also you want to keep one organ alive, which is your brain. Because your brain only burns sugar. There's some caveats in there, but majority of it is sugar. So the good news is, 10 hours sleep, bang, you're back to normal metabolic control. So here we're able to show that people who slept too little, but also too much, it had an effect, it had an interaction with their metabolic control. But the most interesting bit is when you started to group these together. So good behaviours are on the right-hand side. So these people moved quite a lot, high sit time and a good sleep. And as you looked at them together, you ended up with this cluster of behaviour. So if you didn't have disease, you slept well, you didn't sit that much, and you moved quite a lot. Whereas if you had heart disease, you slowly moved towards the other side. If you had type 2 diabetes, you were even further. And again, if you had type 2 diabetes with heart problems, you were even further to the left again. And so this was one of in fact, the first study that showed that even though we knew that people sat too little, moved too little, and had poor sleep, independently related to type 2 diabetes, we were the first group to show that these things all knitted together. In fact, the relative risk, instead of being up about 70%, was up nearly 230% for you having all three behaviours together. At this point, I put my common sense hat on and go, if you've had a bad night's sleep, you're going to sit down a lot, you're going to make poor food choices, and you're not likely to get up and go for a run. It all makes sense. But in practical terms, that means that when we're trying to help people, we shouldn't just be thinking about sitting, physical activity, sleep, or food independently. We should be exploring and understanding what's going on in a person's life so we can help them change not just one of those, but all of those. So it's having some quite profound ways that we're starting to think. The second part I wanted to put on, because one of the things that Kathy mentioned is that this is bringing groups together. I work with groups in Sydney, Australia, Melbourne, Australia, Calgary, Canada, and also Exeter, with the UK Biobank, also Oxford and Cambridge and some other groups in the middle. When you put such an enormous and powerful resource like UK Biobank, you bring together all these groups around them. So I work with the Sydney team because they have expertise in the statistical analysis. So we said, right, well, we need to work with you guys. We work with the Melbourne team because they work with cancer and they're one of the best groups in the world. Well, we go and work with those guys. It's like having an amazing football team, amazing football pitch. If you've got the football pitch, the players will come. And that's exactly what's happening here. So this is some data from Tim Frayling, who I've known for a lot of years. And Tim was asking the opposite question, was, if you took a group of people who were genetically at risk, so forget about whether genetics relates or doesn't, these are people who are genetically predisposed to weight gain, what were the differences in their behaviour? And what Tim showed is, so the red line is people who do have a genetic predisposition, and the blue line, they don't have a genetic predisposition, is that independent of genetics, these people had different behaviours too. So they drank more fizzy drinks, they had more fried food intake, they ate more fat, more protein, and they were less active, they sat more. So in the genes there were these interactions. So not just are you likely to have a different weight gain, your behaviour was different too. What Tim was able to show was that whereas we showed these groups together, they was able to show a relationship with the genetic risk of an individual with the sitting time. So if you have the genetic risk, it amplified the amount your problems because you sat more. And the difference is about 1.5 kilos or 3 pounds in fat. So you do see these interactions, but it wasn't just about sitting times. Inactivity was the same, and also activity was the same. But one of the powerful things about having such a big data set is that it allows you to, or it gives you some cautions every now and again. So a good example is there's the same type of interaction for things like sun cream. So it makes us question and go back to first principles of, we've got these cross-sectional associations, but what do they really mean? And that's why working with you for the rest of your lives is actually going to be a career for me as well as it is for you. Because what we really need to understand, and by working with you over your entire life, is how these things work together. So it's very easy to do these cross-sectional studies, but the real nuggets that will change policy and change the way that your children and your grandchildren work will come over the years to come. And at this point, it's interesting to come back to this because it's really starting to challenge the way that we will give blanket information. So we all know we should sit less, move more, not be as big. But I think over the coming years, we're going to be able to tell you in more specific ways how much. Talk about you rather than as a population. Give feedback to you in a more specific way. And that's going to become apparent to us because you've contributed your data and allowed us to do that. Or put another way, the other thing that we're learning is if your BMI, how big you are, is determined by your friends and also your postcode. It starts to challenge the way that we think about giving information. So instead of going to your doctors and them saying, listen, I'm sorry, Mr. Mike, you've got type 2 diabetes. You need to lose weight, move more, or you're going to be on the next drug. I walk out going, crikey, I never knew I needed to lose weight, move more. But no, I did know that. I've been told that for the last 20 years. What we're realizing is that we need to go beyond how we give people information, and data sets like this do it. What it means is that our health decisions are being made over here. And we're being made in groups. Because your postcode determines your BMI. It's because they're the shops that you have access to. It's how many fast food outlets are around you. It's how good the environment is around you to allow you to become more active. It's the culture for how you behave. So do you go to the pub on a Friday night and drink 15 pints and have a curry? Well, some of you might do. But what this tells us is that by having such big data sets, that instead of me just telling you you need to do something, it means that we need to help you and give you different tools. So the other reason is because if we think about how long as individuals, if you have diabetes, how long you spend making decisions yourself versus how long you make decisions under the care of somebody in the NHS, they're at completely different magnitudes. So we need to help people stay well and stay away from the NHS. And the way we'll do that is by helping you make decisions yourself. So I'm hoping over the next decades we're going to see this closing of the loop of data from you to scientists, but then coming back to you, because that's when we will really have achieved the objectives of Biobank. And so in my talk, I started off by introducing to you the concept that science is really simple. Calories in, calories out determine, for most of us, your risk of long-term disease. The devil, of course, is in the detail. In our work in Biobank, we've understood that we need to change the way that we think about helping people with behaviour, from thinking about just 1 or 2 or 3 behaviours to thinking about them all at the same time. And that's going to challenge the way that we make council policies, the way that your doctor talks with you, the way that you get food advertising. And the final part is that over the coming years, we're going to understand more the genetics and lifestyle and how they interact, so we can give you more specific information about how you can live that ultimate life of being happy until you decide you no longer want to be with us. At that point, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to a question or two.